Hello everyone! How quickly time flies. It feels like just recently we have discussed the agent balance in episode 6, and now episode 7 has swiftly approached. As it customary at the beginning of each episode, don't confuse it with the act, I've created a new tier list. You know, this time it became even more interesting because 2 new agents have been added, and for the first time in Valorant's history someone has risen to the top of the leaderboard who was never been there before. Usually I try to maintain a balance between the matchmaking meta and the professional meta, and this time it was the most challenging task. But it seems like I managed it. So let's not waste any time and get started, beginning with the tier 5. Well, there is not much to talk about in tier 5, this time I've placed one agent here, Yoru. Let's get through this quickly, because Yoru is an agent from Japan and nobody even picked him in Masters Tokyo, so he isn't respected even in his homeland. So why should we pick him then? But on a serious note, Yoru hasn't been picked in either matchmaking or professional games for quite a while. Some individuals may argue that it's just a matter of not knowing how to play him and that anyone can pick this agent. However, if you compare Yoru to someone like Jet, it's evident that 99% of players will choose Jet because, yeah, you can have fun and be creative with Yoru, but it is simply not practical in matchmaking, and there is not much point to it. Now let's move on to the tier 4 list, and it will certainly surprise you. Sage, who was somewhat reluctantly placed in tier 2 last time, has now dropped all the way to tier 4. Why is that like this? Firstly, a significant part of her pick rate was due to the icebox map, which has been removed, and this has resulted in her not being as essential as before. Secondly, there are now agents who can replace Sage's role effectively, and overall, is she really a great healer when she can only heal herself for 30 health points? Frankly, the developers may have overdone it with Sage. On the other hand, she has always been quite high, or at least in the middle, so it's not too alarming for her to sit in tier 4. As for Phoenix, it's similar to Yoru, maybe 1% better. Again, you can play him everywhere, but how effective will it be? That's the crucial question here. So Phoenix has been at the bottom for quite some time now. Neon is better than Phoenix, but it's not quite tier 3 agent. This agent is only picked on Fracture and Breeze, and even then in just 1 out of 5 games at best. Such statistics won't be enough to climb higher. Neon's ultimate is very weak, and the problem is that the higher the skill level of players, the worse this ultimate becomes, since its time to kill is too high for Valorant's gameplay. Gecko, like Neon, seems like an interesting agent. You can come up with many cool setups, and Gecko has even contributed to Sage being less picked on Bind, among other reasons. In general, you can create some decent rounds with Gecko, but it feels like there is something missing. Personally, I think the ultimate and the Dizzy ability are somewhat weak, and maybe tweaking these 2 abilities would make the agent perform better. For example, making Dizzy activate faster and Blind more often, or giving the ultimate slightly more health points. Now let's wrap up tier 4 with Chamberman. Yes, he received some buffs, but they still might not be enough. A sentinel with just 1 trap. Also, after the update, his playstyle doesn't resemble duelist much, and I tested him myself and it didn't quite click with me. The developers have trapped themselves with Chamber because now it's unclear what to do with him. They need either to move him towards being the true sentinel by adding a second trap, or buff his teleport to make him more of a duelist, but for now he remains in tier 4. Let's start tier 3 with a somewhat unusual agent. Reyna, whom I've always placed lower, has now been moved to a more central position. But what's changed? As I mentioned, it's essential to balance between professional games, where Reyna is rarely picked, and matchmaking, where she is one of the most popular agents, so I decided to place her somewhere in the middle. Other than that, nothing new has happened with Reyna. If you feel like playing aggressively and want to frag out, she remains an ideal choice. Also, I'd consider putting her in tier 1 for team deathmatch style games, as she excels there. Next up is Harbor, who was previously on tier 4 or 5. During episode 6, Harbor received some buffs, and now the agent seems to have found its niche. Pearl Harbor has become almost canonical for this agent, and it has become his strongest map. So if you feel like memorizing lineups for Viper, you can take Harbor and showcase some impressive gameplay. However, it's essential to understand that Harbor on Pearl will mostly play the role of the second smoker. 1 smoker might not be enough. If you don't want to play 2 smokers, which is often the case in matchmaking, then it's better to pick Astra, who is the next agent in this tier list. Astra indeed covers essential needs on the map Pearl, and after their work it has become even more straightforward. She also performs quite well on Split. Of course, she's not the same meta Astra from a year ago, but that's fine. Other than that, the agent hasn't changed much. She didn't quite fit on Lotus, and playing her can be somewhat challenging, so so she remains in tier 3 for now. Another new agent for the tier list is Deadlock. Initially, many people thought she was weak, confusing and unnecessarily. However, after playing her a bit more in matchmaking, I don't think that's the case. She's just not your typical sentinel, or rather she's a sentinel in a different sense, similar to Chamber for example. I personally really like her wall and her traps. Yes, they might not be suitable for covering your back, but they seem to serve a different purpose. For example, they work very well for guarding the planted spike. Fate has been quite sad lately. The changes to her cast were very significant, resulting in her being picked much less frequently. I'd say Sova ultimately won that battle, and KO is also close by. I combined them together because first of all, I don't want to stretch the video too much, since there are more and more agents to cover. Secondly, they all fall into a similar category, so to speak. Sova got weaker due to absence of both Breeze and Icebox, however, he's still strong on Ascent and Heaven, which is why he's not in tier 4. KO is mainly brilliant on Ascent, where he's almost irreplaceable, but Fate is at risk of dropping to tier 4 if things keep going the same way. Continuing with the list, we have Cypher, who is also a rather peculiar agent. On one hand, you can play him almost on every map. If you can play Cypher like nuts, then you can win with him almost on every map. On the other hand, there is another sentinel who is currently slightly better in almost everything, but we'll get to that later. Next on the list is Brimstone. If Astra is more versatile, Brimstone is at the very least much simpler to use. He fits perfectly on Bind and Fracture. Even without Bind, Brimstone was already in tier 3 for me, but with Bind he gets closer to tier 2 than the other agents on this list. However, 2 maps might not be enough to rank him higher. Now let's move on to the tier 2 list. Like I mentioned earlier, the tier lists are significantly influenced by the maps present in map pool. The first agent on the tier 2 list is Viper. This is not surprising. Viper has been strong for quite some time, even though her strongest map Icebox along with Breeze were removed. She still found her place on Lotus, and she performs well as the second smoker on many other maps. Unlike Harbor, she is slightly more self-reliant. The difference between matchmaking and professional games come into play here. In matchmaking, 2 smokers are rarely picked, and sometimes even 1 smoker isn't taken. So Viper might not fully unlock her potential in your matches on Gold, Platinum or Immortal ranks. Still, I can't rank her lower because she is subjectively strong, and the situation with her is different from the Reyna. Rey seems to have received no changes, but she has risen higher. The reason is that I can't place her in the same category as Harbor, just as I can't put Harbor alongside Phoenix and Yoru. The addition of Lotus was beneficial for both Raze and Viper. Without it, Raze might have remained in tier 3, but with Lotus she became even stronger. The value of her nade for holding Alon on defense combined with Omen's Flash and Breach Stun for example adds significant tactical advantage. By the way, the next agent on the list is Omen. Not much has changed for him either, he remains in tier 2 just as he was before. Once again, Lotus fits perfectly with Omen, making him the best smoker for this map. Additionally, the removal of Icebox, where Omen was rarely picked, solidified his position in tier 2. The same applies to Breach, whom I mentioned just now. He was in tier 2 before and he stays there. Although not as confidently, Breach is more on par with Brimstone. Both agents fall somewhere in between tier 2 and tier 3. Currently, Breach could benefit from a more reliable stun, as it often feels like opponents become more accurate after being stunned, especially after his ultimate. Nevertheless, Breach remains in tier 2, albeit on the edge. And finally, perhaps surprisingly for some, we are now moving on to the tier 1 agents, and this time there are 3 times more agents in this category than before. Let's start with an agent who has never been on this list before, Sky. Suddenly, Sky ended up at the top. And why is that? It is all because on Split she has a 100% pick rate, and on Bind and Heaven she is picked in 9 out of 10 games. She also performs excellently on Lotus, plus when Breeze returns she won't go anywhere because she was frequently picked on Breeze as well. Even though her ultimate is still quite buggy and it can fly off in a random directions, she has managed to claim her spot in tier 1. However, there is a slight fear that she might get nerfed or that something will be done with her flashes, like reducing their range. Nevertheless, Sky is rightfully in tier 1 list at that moment. Next on the list is Killjoy. She doesn't have any maps where she is picked in 100% of games, maybe only on Heaven. The only time she is not picked is if someone else picks Chamber, but that happens quite rarely, and in any case, Chamber is not a direct replacement for her. As I mentioned before, wherever Cypher is played, Killjoy can also be played, and currently she does it better. Maybe she falls slightly behind Cypher on Split, but Bind is mostly played without sentinels, with just 2 smokers like Viper and Brimstone on providing enough control. So Killjoy confidently holds her spot in the tier 1 list just because she is picked very frequently and in many places. And the last agent, as you probably guessed, is Jett. Despite all the meta's ups and downs, Jett remains the most consistently powerful agent throughout the 3 years of the game existence. At Masters Tokyo, she had a 100% pick rate on 3 maps. Achieving a 100% pick rate on 3 maps is a remarkable achievement, especially in such prestigious tournament. Interestingly, on those same 3 maps, namely Heaven, Pearl and Ascent, Raze had a 0% pick rate, showing how they complement each other. In fact, Jett, Killjoy and Skye all have the same pick rate at 59%. They're evenly matched and it's difficult to single out the best among them, which might not even be necessarily since they fulfill different roles. So on this positive note, I'll conclude this tier list. Feel free to share your thoughts and opinions in the comments, and with that the video comes to an end. Thanks everyone who watched and see you soon. Bye bye.